Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, and welcome back to yet another Injustice video. Now with us having ever so recently talked about the dead characters of the series, as well as the missing ones from Injustice Gods Among Us, today I wanted to take a bit of a step back and tackle a pretty interesting topic that's been the wide centre of debate in the community ever since the second installment of the series, and that's regarding the possible inclusion of the Watchmen, characters from Alan Moore's beloved graphic novel from 1986. Now for those mildly unaware, considering the date of its release, Watchmen is regarded as a beloved classic amongst the superhero genre. A tale and story that's still held up in very high regard to this day for what it represented at the time for the genre, taking both a grounded approach whilst tackling very mature subject matters and themes, which was not completely uncommon for the time. Watchmen was very unashamed of how it touched on those matters, dragging your face right through it as it dripped in satire and nuance that really challenged its readers for its time. And you gotta keep in mind that this was all before the crazy edginess of the 90s comics, so not only was it unique for its time, but honestly, Watchmen could be kind of seen as a bit of a precursor and a source of inspiration for what would follow for the next decade of comics. It's one of the reasons why it's considered so important for its time. But a narrative like this can only be held up by its characters, individuals that do shepherd along the story. And it must be said that some of the characters introduced through Watchmen are some of the most iconic individuals of not just that time period, but comics as a whole. From the omnipotent Dr. Manhattan to the nihilistic comedian and the ever-elusive manic Rorschach. These are all names, faces, and icons that are synonymous with Watchmen. So with that in mind, how exactly does this translate over to Injustice? Should this ever be tackled? And what even kind of sparked this idea in the first place? That is what we will be talking about and analysing today, as this was quite a highly requested video on your part, and has been a bit of a hot topic of debate all the way back since 2017. So let's actually talk about it, break it down, and talk about what elements of each character work and don't work. But before we do begin, as always, just a quick reminder here, that if you like what we're doing here and you do wish to see more, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, as well as to use the new hype mechanic. It's a small thing, but it really does go a very long way here for the channel, especially with YouTube's current weird fluctuating algorithm, which seems to be hitting YouTubers all across the board here. So it'd really help out a ton if you could just do that, as it helps out both this video and the channel as a whole. Anywho, let's get right into things. Starting with the question of, does the world of Injustice fit as a suitable one for the characters of Watchmen? And I'd arguably say yes, especially in terms of tone for sure. Because when the One Earth regime was formed under Superman's rule, it honestly kind of fits into the themes and narrative elements of Watchmen, at least in the sense of government control, as the Watchmen themselves were only ever really disbanded due to the Keene Act enforced by the world's government, which had it so the supers either worked directly for them, or that they went into retirement. Both worlds in that regard tackle those elements and themes, where you either work with them, or you're against them. So both worlds do retain those elements and threads of each other. But with that said, much has honestly changed since the days of the One Earth regime, with it now thriving and restored following the fall and defeat of Superman. So bearing that in mind, maybe the Watchmen are a little too late to the race, especially if they were to be inserted in as freedom fighters. But even so, and call it a morbid curiosity, I would genuinely be quite interested to see how the Watchmen would thrive in a world that embraces them, one that wants them to prosper instead of perish. But again, that's under us all being completely unaware of what the general premise of a third Injustice game would be. So anything is kind of possible or on the table in that regard, but it also kind of brings us onto the question of, why was this even considered in the first place? Because there's at least a 25-year gap between Watchmen and the first Injustice game. So why was this even considered? Was it to tie into an animated movie, or to homage Zack Snyder's live-action depiction? Well, there's actually a reasonable answer to this. As during the release of Injustice 2 in 2007, DC at the time were setting up a huge storyline and event, that being Doomsday Clock. but the plot device to start this would be known as the Button, where the comedian's badge would wind up in the main continuity of comics, set forth by the New 52. And the reason why it was so big is that canonically, this was the first time anything Watchmen related truly translated over to the main line of DC Comics. As for the longest time, whilst Watchmen was under the DC comic book banner, it was always left as its own separate continuity. It didn't have that baggage or ties to any other universe. So when the Button arrived in the DC continuity, it caused a huge resurgence in the popularity of the Watchmen once again. So it was only a matter of time before both worlds collide in a huge storyline. Now, keep in mind that Injustice 2 released on May 16th, 2017, and the Button itself released on June 17th. So they more or less went hand in hand with each other here. And it also really didn't help that during the Fighter Pack trailer, which teased DLC, one of the characters in the background was wearing a fedora, something of course synonymous with Rorschach. Alas, despite the community's pleas, the wishes of a Watchmen crossover never quite took fruition, but it did at the very least open up the window of possibility for what people wanted to see, as the events of Doomsday Clock itself showed that it was very possible for characters of that world to wind up in the mainline continuity. So with that said, this now brings us onto the question of what characters fit from the world of Watchmen, who settles into this premise and universe the best, and who exactly are the strongest contenders here. So now, let's go through each of the Watchmen characters, starting with Night Owl and Silk Spectre. And the reason why I'm pairing them together is because they do bear a lot of similarities to each other. Both having super strength and super speed, both are extremely capable and highly trained in hand-to-hand combat, and both are successors to the mantle from their predecessors in the Minutemen, effectively being second-generation heroes. In fact, they share so much in common that it has gone down on record that they are evenly matched against each other. So they are equals, but that's also kind of the reason why I'm including them here. Because of all of the Watchmen, Night Owl and Silk Spectre are kind of vanilla in comparison to their compatriots. And even so, in the Injustice universe, with Night Owl himself being heavily inspired by Batman and Ted Kord, the original Blue Beetle, and Silk Spectre herself taking heavy influence from Black Canary and Phantom Lady. Whilst I wouldn't entirely void the idea of these two, it would be kind of hard to justify their inclusion with such similar characters having already existed here. And in terms of powers and toolkits, beyond their super strength and super speed, there isn't much to them beyond that. And I feel that's what kind of makes them slip through the cracks here a bit. Plus, personally, considering how their story ended in Watchmen, where they do fall in love with each other and do retire from the superhero business completely, in a world and ending that bleak, I kind of feel okay with them not returning, just so that ending can be maintained. I mean, hell, this ending is largely maintained for the most part even during the events of Doomsday Clock. So in that regard, I'm kind of okay with these two kind of missing things out. Now moving along, we do have Ozymandias. And whilst not my personal favourite pick here, I can't lie, I would absolutely love to see him be included in some capacity, as Adrian's master level tactical mind could really fill in the gap left behind by figures like Lex Luthor and Brainiac. His genius level intellect makes him such a formidable figure in the Watchmen comics. So much so that he's smart enough to pull the veil over his fellow compatriots' eyes to frame the Watchmen, covering his tracks unbelievably well until the novel's finale. And his intellect would be matched by his strength and power, being strong enough to overpower the likes of Night Owl and Rorschach at the same time, and even completely dominating the comedian. Ozymandias is a truly formidable force, as his style of combat isn't aimless swings. He's trained, he's tactical, and he's lethal. The brains justify the brawns, which is what makes Ozymandias so compelling as a villainous figure. But even with that aside, it's his moral compass as a character that makes him so compelling. Believing that the ends justify the means, no matter how awful the act may be, is what I really feel makes him at home in a world like Injustice. A world that is morally grey that was built upon the death of the Joker, kind of feeding into the pipeline of was Clark justified in killing the Clown Prince of Crime, preventing any further or future deaths, or that stepping over that line means you can't come back from it. Ozymandias really plays into that moral ambiguity very, very well, and whilst Doomsday Clock does dial that back a little, showing that he is not absolved of his guilt, it nonetheless does not stop him from being a conniving and threatening figure, someone willing to do anything in order to achieve his goals. Which also makes it really interesting as to which side would he truly join here. The regime or insurgency? Because in my mind, if we're talking about Ozymandias, this is an individual that I would see joining either side, knowing full well that he could utilize people like pawns, doing things for his own ulterior motives. So from a character and lore standpoint, I firmly feel like Ozymandias is a wonderful choice that fits into this universe. Which now takes us onto our next character here, the Comedian. And this man is an absolute bastard, and I think that's what makes him so compelling as a character. Because unlike the other characters of the Watchmen who are heroes, or at the very least anti-heroes, the Comedian is effectively a villain cosplaying a hero. Whilst the Watchmen novel itself only features him very briefly, and sprinkles him throughout the narrative, it doesn't just give us a rough idea of who the Comedian is, but the man behind the mask, Eddie Blake, as there is no actual separation between the man and the mask. Eddie is by all intents and purposes what you would call a nihilistic sociopath. We always talk about characters operating in the grey, but the Comedian by all intents and purposes operates in the red, using any opportunities or chances to justify his violence and bloodshed, which was no wonder after the Watchmen was dissolved. He would actually actively choose to remain with the US government, even having played a hand in the Vietnam War, in order to cause more chaos and death. His perception of right and wrong is so warped that half the time he saw his friends as his enemies and his foes as his allies. And whilst this did definitely change in his later years, it was always abundantly clear that Eddie had a bleak view of the world. It was cruel, ruthless, and without mercy, and so was he because of that. But I guess that was always the somewhat irony of the character, being called the Comedian, but at the end of the day, what was there really to laugh about? Haunted by actions of the past, and burdened by the knowledge of Ozymandias' plans. So, would he fit into the world of injustice? Well, I do think so to a certain degree. The Comedian himself as a fighter is absolutely no slouch, as it satiated his palate for violence. And having specialized in hand-to-hand combat at the peak of human strength, he was a very dangerous villainous figure, with it actually being documented that he was able to beat Ozymandias in his youth, a scar that Adrian would bear until he killed him. And along with this, the Comedian does have an affinity for weapons, being a very gifted marksman and skilled with any firearm. So for sure, the Comedian could hang here. But now, could I see him even really fitting into the Injustice universe? Well, kind of. Here's the thing, someone with his track record, mindset, and attitude would absolutely have no place in Batman's insurgency. And if he dare stepped out of line in the regime, he most certainly would be given the Shazam treatment. So if the Comedian was to be included here, I do feel like he'd wind up being more of a wildcard character. But even so, in the world and reality of the Injustice universe, whilst he fits amongst the cast, I can't see how anyone would want to be associated with him in any capacity, as he would be a small fish in a much greater pond. And as much as I'd love to see Jeffrey Dean Morgan return to play the character and voice him again, the truth is, how do you even really justify the inclusion of the Comedian here? As his death is the inciting incident that sparks the rest of the graphic novel for Watchmen. So in that regard, I think he's kind of limited with how he can be used, and would honestly be more fitting as a DLC character. So this now brings us onto arguably the most iconic face of the Watchmen, Rorschach. Now Walter Kovacs is a very polarizing figure in The Watchmen, arguably being the lens of which the audience stares through, due to him being the detective of the story. But beneath the mask and grim exposition is a man willing to stand on the brink of Armageddon for justice, even if he himself has to break every possible law to justify getting the correct answer. Rorschach as a character is a very captivating personality, and in a world this bleak, is the closest thing you have to a vigilante superhero trying to do the somewhat right thing. Even so, it's pretty evident that as a person, Rorschach isn't quite there mentally, having been abused growing up, to then being mentally broken when a little girl was killed and then fed to dogs. That moment right there was the turning point for the character, as the line between right and wrong began to blur, and Walter Kovacs kinda seeped out of his mind, with the only person being left being Rorschach, as he even refers to his mask as his face. But despite his mind being scattered, he's never been one to back away from his morals or beliefs, even willing to die for them, which is why so many consider him to be a true hero. Thus, in many ways, Rorschach does mirror many elements of Batman's character, where the lines between the man and the mask are blurred, and how both are willing to live and die by their code. Now, as hand-to-hand combat goes, Rorschach does actually come up quite short here, being the weakest member of the Watchmen, as he does lack those superhuman qualities to him. But how he makes up for that is with his tenacity and mind, being incredibly intelligent despite being a bit insane, and incredibly resourceful, as he's able to create and fashion weapons out of very simple household appliances. It makes him a very scrappy fighter. So, could I see him in the Injustice universe? Well, kind of like the comedian, yes and no. Because, well, Walter Kovacs is dead. But I don't think that's a problem here. In truth, Rorschach is an idea of defiance, and someone who is able to walk head-on into the apocalypse. And whilst the mantle itself has been passed on to Reggie Long, you don't really have to justify who's under the mask here. That is what I feel makes him so special here. Plus, I can't lie, I think it'd be super awesome to play as an unhinged poor man's Batman, taking stage interactables and kind of fashioning them into weapons. But even jokes aside, this is definitely a character I'd like to see be included in some capacity here, even if it's worn by Walter Kovacs, Reggie Long, or someone else. And I mean, hey, if he's DLC, he doesn't have to be strictly bound to that of the narrative to justify his inclusion. Plus, I can't lie, I'd also really like to have Jackie Earle Haley back to voice him. But if he is to be involved in the narrative in some way, shape and form, how do I think this would go? Well, I think much like the comedian, he would actually be a bit of a wild card here. Him being okay with killing would naturally put him in the bad books of Batman. And I mean, hell, when the two even did encounter each other in Doomsday Clock, Bruce did lock him away in Arkham Asylum, calling him insane, and he's not wrong. Besides, Rorschach would call Batman's insurgency soft, as they aren't willing to kill their enemies. And as for the insurgency, there's absolutely no way in hell that Rorschach of all characters would align himself with Superman, as his moral compass would pit him against this authoritarian god. If anything, I could see him battling this head-on by himself, even if he knew it would lead to his death. So this now brings us onto our last and final character here, Dr. Manhattan. And woof, I can't lie, this is a difficult one for me to tackle, as he's a being that prioritizes logic and outcome by his perception of time and space. To say that Dr. Manhattan is a god would actually be an understatement, being able to warp reality, time and matter at his fingertips. But let's be for real and get to the point. Could or should Dr. Manhattan appear in Injustice? Probably not. I know, hear me out. You see, narratively, I would actually love Dr. Manhattan to appear here, as I do think he does wonders for the story, and I'll get into that in a bit. But I think Dr. Manhattan's biggest problem with being included here is that it's being included in a fighting game. Just humor me here. Because, you see, in the world of fighting games, where we have a plethora of big bads and iconic names and faces, one of the biggest hurdles of being a boss is being able to maintain that facade after you're defeated. And truth be told, once a villain is defeated at their boss-like status, they begin to slowly but surely go down step by step until they are kind of watered down and can't bounce back. And that's arguably a very similar position that Dr. Manhattan has been put in. Like, let us take Shao Kahn as a perfect example here. Had a really threatening presence upon his initial debut, but upon each installment and each defeat, it's largely diluted what he once represented. And the reason why I'm bringing this up here is because a very similar thing can happen to Dr. Manhattan. And in my opinion, it really shouldn't. Everyone talks about the idea of Dr. Manhattan as a fighting game character, but the truth is that if you looked at him in so much as the wrong way, he could liquefy you. There is no actual real fight there. And here's the thing, if that's not the case and there is a fight here, is it then feeling truly faithful to the character who's been written, described and placed as a nigh omnipotent god? Do you purposely nerf the character at the risk of disrespecting the source material? And I don't think that is too wise. Like, just to put this into context, with this being a fighting game, imagine if Dr. Manhattan was to get his ass beat by Robin. Yeah, that's a pretty cursed thing to throw out into the ether, but that's what I kind of mean here. Because if certain characters like this aren't protected, you inevitably kind of wind up with a bit of a Shao Kahn situation. So I hope you're all kind of understanding the perspective I'm coming from here with this. But even with that said, and even with that in mind, there are some really excellent pros to him being included here. Because this opens up like Pandora's box. As one of the biggest issues that people take with the Injustice continuity is character deaths and how they die, largely limiting its cast and characters for who can appear and who can't. But John kind of takes all of those problems away. With his ability to manipulate time, he could effectively rid the world of every wrong ever created at that point. The arrow that pierced John Kent's shoulder? Well, the arrow never bounces. The Steve Trevor that warped Wonder Woman's perception of man? Well, he never arrived at the island. And hell, the room that the Joker fills with the Kryptonian fear toxin takes no effect. Dr. Manhattan could fix all of these narrative issues. That is, if he's not shackled to being a fighting game character, which is really difficult to say because we're talking about Injustice. But my own personal suggestion, and a ballsy ambitious wish that I personally think would work, is that if he was to appear as DLC, so the main story can have its big stakes, and it can do whatever wild shit they need to, that causes casualties and damage beyond its repair, only for Dr. Manhattan to walk in during his arcade ladder ending, and clean things up. You see, typically with DLC characters in NetherRealm games, a lot of them are non-canon, but with it being Dr. Manhattan, this may be an instance where a DLC arcade ladder ending character actually makes himself canon. He sees what has become of this universe, how this Superman had faltered, and maybe even have it so he resets the entire continuity, which I know some people have been asking for, and something I really feel he is capable of. Here's the thing, I actually really like Dr. Manhattan, especially with what he represents as a character, but you gotta kind of respect him for what he is. And that simply might be a bit of a problem or a struggle if he features in a fighting game. Because if I'm not physically turning people into meat bags, am I really playing as Dr. Manhattan? Just a little bit of something to think on. So with that said and everything covered here, this has been it for my breakdown, analysis and deep dive on whether or not the Watchmen should appear in Injustice 3. And I do hope you have enjoyed this ride, as this one's been kind of different from how I normally tackle videos on the channel, but I did really want to kind of dive into the Watchmen and give it the time, attention and respect it deserves, as it's a novel that's influenced so many of my own personal favourite stories, and holds a very special place in many comic book fans' hearts. Whilst I myself don't think the likelihood of all of them appearing in one game is too high, I would really like to see some of them be included in some capacity. So with that in mind, I now relay the question to all of you of, if a Watchmen character was to be included here, which of them would you like to see? Who is at the top of your list? And who would you like to play? Please do comment down below. But until the next one everyone, that has been it for me. So as always, take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.